We will now review body cavities. Cavities are spaces within your body that help organize certain compartments and their organs inside. We can look at the body, and there's actually two large cavities shown here in yellow and in red. In yellow, we have what's called the dorsal cavity. Dorsal means posterior or back. So you notice that most of this cavity is on the posterior or back side. The dorsal cavity can be subdivided into the cranial cavity, which holds the brain, and the vertebral cavity, which holds the spinal cord. Now in red, we see the ventral cavity. Ventral means anterior or in front. So you notice that the ventral cavity is in the front side of the person. The ventral cavity can also be subdivided into two major cavities, the thoracic cavity on top or superior, and the abdominal pelvic cavity on the bottom or inferior. And the diaphragm is the good dividing landmark between the thoracic cavity above and the abdominal pelvic cavity below. So one important term is viscera. Viscera refers to any organ that's inside the ventral cavity, so here in red. So for example, in your thoracic cavity, you would have your heart and your lung. Those are considered viscera. In your abdominal pelvic cavity, you have a lot of your digestive organs like the liver, the stomach, intestine. Those are also considered viscera. Again, organs in your ventral cavity. You might talk about having some visceral pain. For example, a stomach ache would be visceral pain. When you see the word visceral with the L on the end, that's just an adjective. Now notice the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities are rather large, so we can actually even divide those even further. The thoracic cavity, which has the heart and the lungs, actually has separate cavities for each of those. So the pleural cavity shown here is the cavity that contains your lungs. Anytime you see the word pleural or pleura, that's referring to lungs. The pericardial cavity in the center has the heart inside of it. Anytime you see the word pericardial or pericardia, that refers to the heart. The mediastinum is actually just the space in between the lungs. So it's down the center of your chest. And in the mediastinum, you'll have your heart. And you'll also have organs like your trachea and your esophagus going down your throat. The abdominal pelvic cavity is also large, so we can subdivide that into the abdominal cavity on the top and the pelvic cavity below. So the abdominal cavity holds the majority of those digestive organs, and the pelvic cavity is where your urinary bladder is located. All right, so now that we've gone through the body cavities, let's talk about some membranes. So these cavities, again, are spaces that hold organs in them, and they are helping to organize the body. Now, each of these cavities are protected by a membrane. So these membranes are there to protect the cavities and line the cavity. So importantly, these cavities are lined by what we call serous membrane. Serous membrane, there's three that you need to know. Pleura is the serous membrane that surrounds the lungs. Remember I said anything that says pleura or pleural refers to lung. So the pleura will protect the lungs. Pericardium is the serous membrane that's going to protect the heart. So it's going to be surrounding the heart as shown here. And again, pericardia refers to heart. And finally, the peritoneum is a very large membrane that helps protect the abdominal pelvic cavity. So you'll see it surrounding the entire abdomen. Now, one important thing about these serous membranes is because their job is to protect, they actually have two layers to them. So it's kind of like, think about double layering a bag, right? You go to the grocery store and one bag might not be thick enough, so you do two bags. So it's the same thing with the serous membrane. You'll have two layers of membrane that will help surround and protect these cavities. So the two layers, we have an outer layer and an inner layer. So this cartoon here showing the fist punched into a balloon is trying to represent the two layers. So imagine the fist is actually your heart. you'll have a part of the balloon or the membrane actually touching the heart. That's the inner membrane. And then you have the outer edge, which is the outer membrane. So we call the inner membrane the visceral membrane. This one, notice the word viscera in it. This is actually going to be touching the visceral organ itself. For example, in this case, the heart. Or it might be the layer actually touching the lungs or the stomach or the intestine. So again, this is your visceral layer or the inner layer that's hugging the organ. And then you have the parietal layer, which is the outer layer. So in this cartoon version, the parietal layer would be on the outside. So then let's go back to the image of the heart here, which is in the pericardial cavity, surrounded by the pericardium. So you have the visceral pericardium, which is the inner layer of the serous membrane that's touching the heart. And then you have the parietal pericardium, which is the outer layer of the serous membrane surrounding the heart. And recall that the heart lies in the pericardial cavity. Okay? So that wraps up the body cavities. So now you know the major cavities with the organs inside, and then also the membranes that help surround the cavities and protect.